Hello, and welcome to Saving People Queering Things, a supernatural podcast. We were previously known as Driver Picks the Podcast, and the episode you're about to listen to was recorded under that name. Though our name has changed as of season 3, our show hasn't changed that much. Our structure and theme-based discussions are the same, and we're so glad you're here. Now, let's get on the road. Hello, and welcome to Driver Picks the Podcast, the show where we talk about ghosts, road trips, and free will through every episode of the TV series Supernatural. Today, we are exploring Season 2, Episode 11, Playthings, through the theme of peace. I am Abigail, your host, and joining me today is a very special guest, Jessy, who I first met on Supernatural TikTok because we were having a discussion about some meta-analysis of the show. And so I got really excited and invited them to come on and join us. So can you introduce yourself and tell our listeners a little bit about your experience with Supernatural?
Yeah, hi, I am Jessy. That's .tired.gay on TikTok. I got into Supernatural when it was first coming out. I watched the first about 3 seasons, and then my mom got into it, which as a teenager meant that I immediately had to stop liking it at all. But I was also on Tumblr, so I kept up with it a bit. Hard to avoid on Tumblr.
Impossible to avoid on certain sides of Tumblr.
Yeah. And then when I got TikTok, the algorithm sort of decided that it was something that I liked, and I realized that it was right. I just decided to start making TikToks of my own, and the rest is history, I guess.
And what is it that you really enjoy about the show?
So I think there's 2 things. There's what I'm really interested in at the moment, which is looking at the pop culture tie-ins and how the show was influenced by how the show had its outside influences that turned it into what it was, and then how it turned around and influenced pop culture on its own. And just sort of, I really do like the meta-analysis of the show, just sort of how it exists outside of the narrative as well as inside the narrative. And otherwise, I really love the community. I didn't realize until I joined it that there even really was one. It's been wonderful since I got onto Supernatural TikTok to sort of meet people and, be able to scream about this silly show that was very much not geared towards someone like me, but despite their best efforts.
It's so fun to see, like, on places like TikTok, which is such a new platform, some of the same like fandom space kind of being built, and like specifically on, I know the side of Supernatural TikTok that I think you and I are both on, which is very queer friendly. There's a lot of queer creators, people doing that kind of analysis work on the show. And yeah, like you said, we were not the target audience, but it's been cool to see the meaning the show has taken on in those circles, and then also how we've created kind of community around that. Well, thank you for being here. I'm really excited to talk about this episode with you.
Me too.
That brings us to this episode and to our 30-second recap. Yeah, let me know when you're ready and I will count you in.
Alrighty. I guess now?
3, 2, 1, go.
So this episode starts with Sam and Dean after a month trying to search for Ava, and Dean notes that Sam is really not, he's not reacting at all. He's not being his usual depressed self about this. And they decide to take a case that Ellen gives them and go to an inn. It seems to be a haunting or perhaps a voodoo connection that's happening at this inn, and that's my time.
Okay, I think I'm ready.
In 3, 2, 1.
Okay, so it turns out that there is a spirit that has been haunting this place, but it's a little girl who drowned many years ago, and so she's just lonely. So as they're trying to solve this case, Sam also has a bit of a breakdown where he gets drunk and he says, Dean, if I go dark side, you're going to maybe have to kill me. And he makes Dean promise, and Dean does. And then they save the people. And then when they leave, Sam reminds Dean of his promise.
It's the gist.
It's the gist. It's the gist. So it's now time for us to discuss this episode through our chosen theme. And this week, our theme is peace. Where do you want to start?
I think just getting it right out of the way, best way that peace applies to this episode is just that nobody is truly at peace by the end. I mean, even the case itself is kind of left unresolved. I mean, it's resolved, but I don't know, the ends aren't all neatly tied.
Most of their answers to the case are kind of hypotheses, and they don't really confirm this. They rescue the little girl, and she's like, yeah, I can't see Maggie anymore, I can't see the spirit, and they're like, okay, seems cool. You're moving anyway,
which almost seems out of character.
Yeah.
Where they're just like, okay, this is fine, I'm gonna assume that everything's fine.
Yeah, which seems also like a bit of a miss, because we know this building's about to be torn down, and so we get this lovely scene at the end of Maggie and Rose, who are now both spirits. They're dancing and playing, and they've got this house, and they seem kind of at peace, but there's this sort of ominous sense that we have, at least that I have from having watched the episode, because someone's going to come and knock this building down. But I still got the impression that they're still selling the house. They've moved out. So what's going to happen if someone goes to knock this building down? What are these spirits going to do? It's kind of unfinished. And it's weird that Sam and Dean don't even consider that.
They had a lot on their plate.
Yeah, they're a little preoccupied. They saved the people. They're like, okay, good enough for now.
Well, because I think that's part of it too, is just they were ultimately, Sam wanted to take this case not because he cared about it, because he needed to get away from his own mental shit.
Not so much chasing peace, but chasing a little bit of a distraction in terms of a hunt, because we see that from both brothers at many times in this show, where they're trying to not deal with an emotional, some emotional turmoil, and so they're like, how about we go on a hunt and kill some things? Maybe that'll make us feel better.
It's interesting to see that from Sam instead of Dean. I think that a part of that has to do with how many times Sam has felt this way. The repetitiveness of being the reason that somebody else gets hurt, or feeling like he could have done something but didn't or couldn't ultimately help. And it's interesting to see that evolve from what Dean jokes about with the moping and the droopy music and stuff, and turning into him just being like, you know what, it's fine, I've gotten through this before, I'll get through it again, let's just do something.
He says, I'm not going to let other people die either. He's like, we can't rescue Ava right now because we don't know where she is. He said, I'm going to save as many people as I can. And Dean quips that that attitude is way too healthy for me, which
well, introspection from Dean Winchester.
There's a lot of that in this episode, actually. There's a few moments where Dean is remarkably candid about his own mental state. And his mental state is not good, but compared to Sam's in this episode, his is actually okay. At the beginning, at least. Not by the end.
Well, I think that's when it comes to the peace that is achieved or not achieved, a lot of it has to do with just peace of mind. Sorry, Sam is not, he's trying to have some peace of mind about himself. He's trying to reach this point of, if I save enough people, then I won't be evil. Or, trying to find some way to justify his own existence.
Yeah.
And of course, ultimately putting that on Dean and disrupting his peace of mind.
If I'm not successful, if I go dark side anyway, I need to have the peace of mind to know that you're not going to just let me undo all of the good that I've done, or let me kill a bunch of people, or whatever he's afraid that's going to happen with him going dark side, which is a really interesting fear for him to have. Up to this point, really, we haven't seen that from Sam. We haven't seen any reason, there's no reason he should be afraid of what he does when he goes dark side. The only thing that we've seen like when he's really focused on revenge, that he's like has kind of tunnel vision, like a lot like John, not in the exact same way as John, but
it's not healthy for sure.
No, but generally speaking, Sam's got a pretty level head about hunting, a pretty level head about considering other perspectives when it comes to like he's not a shoot first, ask questions later kind of person in general, and he's not a violent person in general, and so it's interesting that his internal peace is so disrupted because of just knowing that the demon has plans for him, or in that he doesn't know what they are. And
I think that a lot of conversations that I see around Sam have to do with him feeling like he doesn't have control over his like anything, from his destiny to his own body.
Yeah, his own identity.
Yeah, and I think that that's like, this is a really important character point for him of like, you know, a desperation kind of to it of him starting to come to terms with like, you know, does anything I do matter?
Right. If I'm going to go dark side anyway, if who I am is out of my control, then yeah, like it starts to get kind of hopeless. And it does, then that leads him to this moment with Dean where he gets drunk and he makes Dean promise to kill him.
Which of course I think is where we should mention how that then ruins Dean's peace of mind.
Yes.
How it is shifting the weight of this onto Dean, who Dean already has it from his dad, and now he has it from Sam too. And maybe he's used to carrying it because of his upbringing, but that doesn't mean he should be used to carrying it.
No. And it's also different than the previous way he's been carrying it, because like his whole childhood and through to this point, like up until all through season 1, until John tells him what John tells him, his primary goal has been like protect Sam. It's been take care of Sam. It's been protect Sam. It's been don't let anything bad happen to Sam. Now it's both protect Sam, and it is, if Sam turns out to be evil, protect other people from Sam by hurting Sam. The contrast of those two things means that he can't ever have any peace, because it's always going to be conflict. Like, and any decision is inevitable. Any decision related to Sam now is inevitably going to fuck up one of those two goals. Sam really desperately needs the peace of mind and the security to know that if something, he goes dark side, that Dean won't allow him to hurt other people. But that does add this huge extra responsibility to Dean. And I think at the beginning, like when Sam first gets drunk and makes Dean promise, I think there's this hope for Dean. I think that Sam won't remember. I think, you know, if Sam doesn't bring this up again at the end of the episode, Dean is going to act like it never happened. But because Sam like reiterates it when he's sober, like Dean realizes Sam wasn't just saying this because he was drunk and exhausted and scared. Like, Sam is saying this because this is actually something that's really rooted really deeply in him.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting how like the questions that are starting to get posed in these earlier episodes, we do end up seeing it pay off, but we don't end up seeing it until the end of season 5, when Dean does have to make the choice. And we can see how, you know, the difference between what everybody wanted him to do and what is probably like morally the right thing to do, versus how he, as a Winchester, the pinnacle of let's figure out a workaround, how he ends up solving the problem. Or, you know, not solving the problem as well.
Well, yeah. It's a very long-term sort of thing. And this is going to be a dynamic that's going to be continual between the two of them. I think that eventually this dynamic kind of stops being one of the primary ways they relate to each other, but for a number of seasons, this is going to be the primary way they like one of the primary like dynamics between them is the idea of like Sam struggling with this sort of sense of inner darkness at different times, either leaning into it or leaning away from it, and Dean struggling with what to do about that. And I think a lot of that does not start with this moment, but this is a really pivotal turning moment where they're linking their destinies sort of together.
So I think that when we're looking at that interaction too, the difference between hearing that kind of question from John versus that kind of question from Sam is really powerful too, because John's dead now. And the longer that Dean is away from John, the clearer he can see his own past and see how his relationship with John was manipulative. You know, maybe that's not a promise that he feels he should keep. Or, you know, if he had been allowed to think about this without Sam's coming in and saying, actually, I agree with Dad, which is not something that I'm sure he expected.
No.
You know, maybe he would have been able to write it off.
After Sam has pointed out that John told Dean, you know, Dad told you might have to kill me. And Dean's like, that's crap. Like, that's crap you don't put on your kids. It makes me think that that's the way he was going with that interpretation. And he was starting to unravel. We talked about this in our episode on In My Time of Dying, how like, and on in Everyone Loves a Clown, where Sam and Dean are both starting to kind of reinterpret John's actions in the light of his death. Dean particularly. Dean has had an interpretation of John and a perception of John as a good parent, not necessarily in the sense that he's like a warm, fuzzy parent, but in the sense that he's a good parent because he protects us, because he is hunting for the thing that killed Mom, because, you know, he taught us to hunt. But so much of like why he needs John to be a good parent and a good hunter is like for his own sense of like identity and worth. Because if John is a good parent, then the way Dean turned out is also good. And the way that he followed John's orders is also good. But now it's like not as simple as that. This we're finding. And now John is giving advice. Like John is giving advice that blatantly contradicts things he's told Dean his whole life. He's saying, oh, you may have to kill Sam, when I've previously told you Sam is your biggest priority to protect. And so Dean is now reinterpreting John, like you said, from the space, the longer he gets without John having this sort of, John doesn't have the same sort of power that he had when he was alive.
I think it's also important that separate from John, they are now interacting with people like Ellen and Joe, and are starting to see how other people operate and how that is very different than from how they operate, and how John isolated them, you know, having only a limited view of like, this is how things are and this is how things shouldn't be. And now you've got other people coming into their lives that are giving them shades of gray.
The last couple of times, you know, like we've seen some of the tensions there. We've seen that her and John had a falling out. We know that John is a lot of the reason why her husband is dead. We know that she's got a level of like hesitation around how much do I trust these boys, particularly around my kid, which I think is a really good hesitation that she has based on those experiences. But she also is able to hold the nuance of like, these are also, Sam and Dean are also young kids basically themselves, who were raised a really particular way, who haven't been shown a lot of nuance or grace, and who don't have a lot of resources or information. And she extends the like this way of caring for them.
She pulls them under her wing.
She does, and she does despite her hesitations. And Bobby's the same way. Bobby's the same way, but in a father figure sort of way, whereas Ellen's a cool aunt.
Yeah, I would not. I whenever I see things of Ellen being like their mom, I'm like, no, that's like Jody. Like Jody is like their mom.
Yeah,
I see that, but no, Ellen, she's more like a cool aunt. She's a bit more distanced, and not in a way that doesn't mean that she doesn't love them like family. And I think it's interesting if you look at it like overarching as a concept of peace, like they suddenly have this new freedom to figure out what they believe and what they want to do with their lives. And instead of causing peace, it's causing friction. I think that like over the course of the show, that's a pretty solid constant, is thinking that, okay, once we do this one thing, then we can rest. And Instead, it's, just the next step to the next thing, which I think is very realistic, but must be exhausting.
Yeah, makes me think of like the line in 116 in Shadow when Sam says, oh, this, like, they think they might be closing in on the demon, and Sam's like, oh, what if this is all over tonight? Like, I'd sleep for a month and then I'd go back to school. And Dean's like, and Sam's like, what would you do, Dean? And Dean's like, I would continue to hunt. And he says this line, like, there's always going to be something to hunt. And that's like the thing about peace, is that like they, as long as there are monsters and as long as they know about them, there's always something to hunt. And they don't manage to. So much of the show and so many of the like really interesting story arcs in the show are going to be about various characters trying to find ways to have peace, either to have peace within the hunting life or to get out of the hunting life because it's the only way they think they'll have peace. The tragedy of the show is that most of the time, for most characters, that's not successful.
Which is where fan fiction comes in.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What do you mean Dean and Cass don't go to the farmer's market? That doesn't sound right.
I'm pretty sure I saw that scene.
Can I talk about it in terms of Gothic literature?
Oh, please do. Please do. That's very important in this episode.
Because in classic Gothic literature, there are a few indicators, a few like typical tropes that show up in this episode. That location tends to be a dilapidated house, which we don't necessarily have here, but it's a house that's about to be demolished.
The pool house is kind of dilapidated. It kind of has that look of like not taken care of.
That's true. They do have that creepy wedding gown in there.
That too.
And there's an element of the supernatural. There's an element of taboo and family dynamics. The thing about Gothic literature as well is that when it ends at the end of the story, you don't really have a happy ending. It's not necessarily a sad ending, but it always leaves this kind of bittersweet. Maybe the protagonists survived, but now they survive with the knowledge of things that they would rather not have. Or in the case of this episode, they survived, but the grandma died. And, they survived, but the grandma and the sister are still ghosts, are still stuck there. And we don't even know if that's a good or a bad thing.
And the family, like this, the daughter and the mother are both, like you said, they have to live now with the experiences they've had. The little girl has to live with this experience of like, I had this imaginary friend that turned out to be a spirit that tried to murder me so that I would never be able to leave her. And like that is a traumatic thing for a child to have experienced.
She was staring at that dead body. This little girl is gonna be a serial killer.
Yeah, yeah, she's gonna reoccur in a few seasons as it's bad times. It's bad times. And the mom too, like they still end up having to leave, like you said, the like bittersweet. They leave the place that could be dangerous, but they still have to leave this like family heritage house that, we had that scene earlier with Dean and the butler, and they're doing the drinks, and he's telling him all these stories of like the historicity of the house and the family heritage there, and they're like having to leave that for all of them, the butler as well, like they're all having to say goodbye to a place that's so significant, even if now staying would be equally sad.
And it's not like the boys can save them from that.
No.
For all the boys can do, they can't stop capitalism.
And like this is a common thing throughout like all of this show. Like one of those things at the end of a lot of episodes, very few supernatural episodes with like a purely happy ending, because most of the time the people who survived are haunted by the people they've lost, even if the danger is gone, which ends up being like a bit of a mirror for the fact that that's the case for Sam and Dean all the ways. Like they often are the ones to survive, but surviving means you sometimes you have to bury people, and that's which may be connecting back to the whole family family dynamics piece.
Well, I think it's interesting in this episode too, we get the further the family dynamics do get more complex, because we start to see Dean for maybe the first time, like starting to voice his own doubts. Like he said to Sam, he says, you know, you don't lay that kind of crap on your kids. And he says it later to the butler when the butler's talking about home, and Dean's like, I don't know, I never really had one. Like, that's rough, buddy.
Yeah. And he's not usually so calmly candid.
And it's wild because it's usually the kind of, I mean, Dean and Sam have switched roles in this episode. That's usually stuff that we would be hearing from Sam.
Yeah, usually Sam is making those connections, and Dean's like candidness there of like, yeah, is a really interesting development for him, especially like that vulnerability that he's expressing by those different statements, which then that vulnerability is countered by this like promise that Sam asks of him. And you see that in like his face during that scene when Sam's begging and pleading with him, and Sam and Dean's like actively trying to talk him out of this. I think because, you know, Dean takes these kinds of like promises quite seriously, and obviously he's already been thinking about this. It's already been so much on his mind because John said it to him. So he's been like wrestling with this and wrestling with this and wrestling with this. And if he like makes a promise, even if Sam doesn't remember it, Dean is going to remember it. And so he's trying to talk Sam out of it, and he's like unable to, but that's just bringing up all this like vulnerability for him.
I mean, it's been a lot of growth. I'm currently in my own rewatch in the middle of season 1, and that's a bit of growth.
Yeah.
From there.
Yeah. Instead of an angry response or instead of a deflection, we get like more real conversation. And the scene at the end too, they, you know, have the conversation again where Sam goes, you know, you made the promise, and Dean isn't able to respond and isn't able to. You get the real strong impression that he's still mulling this over. He's still like reckoning with it. He's still reckoning with like, okay, I made this promise. What does this actually mean? Because, you know, it's still a very vague sort of like, if I become dangerous, if I go dark side, you'll take care of it.
And it is tragic to think, just like, you know, their whole life, especially Sam's, has just been this. And him having to come to terms with like, there's just never, you know, the most calm my life has been is when I ran away from home, and that's over now.
Yeah, and that's not something he's going to go back to.
Yeah, and like Dean probably has gotten used to that, because the calmest time of his life was before his mom died. Like, this is just his life now, and he knows how to be miserable pretty well, which isn't great, but
no. But Sam has not like made peace with that in the same way. He was forced back into the life of hunting. Like, he chose to leave it as an adult, and he was forced back into it because of tragedy. They're still facing the same thing that killed their mom, but now it's killed their mom and their dad and Jess.
He can't undo that. If being fundamentally changed means that he's now evil in some way. I think that's why, like, when he says the bit about destiny, I think one of the more tragic lines.
Yes.
Because he's just been trying to break out of it, and it just keeps dragging him back in.
And this moment is him almost going, you know, he's setting up guardrails so that he can't escape his destiny. Like, he's still going, he's like, the more people I save, the more I can change my destiny. But Dean, if I'm not able to change my destiny, like, you have to make sure that, like, at least I don't hurt people. Like, it's such Sam in season 1 and 2 particularly is such a tragic, him being told continually in early season 2 that his nature is not good is like such a blow to a character like that.
I think it's when he puts that on Dean, I think it's so illustrative of their relationship and how paternal it is, how paternally he views Dean, because that's a rough thing to ask of somebody. It's a selfish thing to ask of somebody who loves you, which doesn't necessarily, like, you know, I mean selfish in a very non-judgmental way, because we all get why he asks it. It's completely ignoring Dean as a human being.
Yes, it's the thing is, he's taking into account the cost to everyone else. To do that, he has to ignore the cost to Dean, which is that Dean would have to kill his brother.
Ironically, how that ends up being a bigger issue. Spoilers in season 5. That's quite literally what everybody wants to happen.
Well, this is what's so fascinating about like things like this that were built into the show so early. When, yeah, the fact that they've constantly set this up as like this whole question of like nature, like your nature and your being versus free will, and then your destiny versus like what your choices are, and then contrasting these two brothers who have wildly different ideas of what destiny is, wildly different ideas of what free will is, but are on the same page when it comes to like protecting each other. And what actually like shifts them into free will is that I think it's just really interesting seeing season 4 and 5 play out after a scene like this.
Well, because I think that like there's the common thread of like Castiel invented free will, which I think is fun, but also like it's important to note how much of the groundwork for free will, for creating their own story, was just the two of them, like,
oh yes,
trying to not kill each other because they cared about each other,
to break free of
brothers, and you don't want to do that. Not to take credit away from my boy Cass or anything, but
no, I mean Cass is kind of crucial to that too, because he's crucial to like a new element of free will in terms of like it's another layer of nature versus and destiny versus like your choices. And also like, Cass illustrates a lot of the idea of when you watch someone and you get into any kind of relationship with someone who is exercising their free will, that also like pushes you to see your own choices. We see Cass learn free will in a lot of ways from the Winchesters, and I can't wait till we get to talk about it in those episodes, but that's obviously a ways away, so now we just sneak it in whenever we can. We get there.
I'm always down to talk about my Lord and Savior Castiel.
I can't wait to get to season 4. I think it's just going to be one good conversation about Cass after the other. Yeah, I think that's all we have to say on this episode in terms of themes. So we're going to move to our next section now. Okay, so next we're going to move into our Going Meta segment, where we are tracking lore, the Bechdel test, pop culture, and more. First off, as our death counter, how many deaths do we have in this episode?
I think it's 3, because we've got the guy who falls down the stairs, the hanging, and the grandma.
Yeah. Next is the Bechdel test.
That's a tough one for Supernatural.
Yeah, it's a low bar that we managed to crash right into a lot of times and not make it over. But I think this episode, because we have a spirit who is a girl, and with that we have a couple of conversations that would potentially pass.
I think we should count it. I think it counts.
I think so too. Yeah, well, because the Maggie and oh, what's the daughter's name?
Tyler? It was like a
Tyler. Yeah, I think it's Tyler. So they have a number of conversations that are not related to men or boys at all. Like they're just them having conversations. And then at the end of the episode, Maggie and Rose, it's not like a spoken conversation, but they are having a conversation. It's very clear that they're like communicating with each other.
And I feel like it's important too that like, especially within the framework of Supernatural, where passing the Bechdel test is not given, where the fact that the motivation for the spirit being there is not related to a man in any way.
Yes.
Like just even in the pilot of the show, the spirit, I don't think she talks to any women, but that's the whole reason that she's there, is to be mad at men.
Yeah. Well, and like this episode, beyond just the Bechdel test, this episode is filled with women. The only significant male character other than Sam and Dean is the butler. And they're women who are not either sexualized or brutalized, which again, usually when we have a female-centric episode, there's a lot of sexualization or like violence. So I like that this episode isn't that. It's refreshing for the show. In terms of the story locations, it takes place in Connecticut, all within one location, no other research happening.
I thought that it was fun that it takes place in an inn, whereas usually we see them in these skeevy motels, and it's such a shift of tone, I think. And even if it's not like the nicest inn in the world, at least you can probably feel comfortable knowing that there aren't magic fingers in the bed.
Yeah. And it's the kind of thing that like, yeah, it might not be everyone's thing, like to go to a gothic styled like hotel, but if it is your kind of thing, this would be a nice one. This would be like an interesting place to stay, you know, beyond the spirit being there. This would be a really interesting place to stay.
And even like the fact that the innkeeper, whose name escapes me, that she assumed they were there to go antiquing, versus the assumptions that might be made at the places where they normally stay, which is even an assumption is made at all, because I feel like places like those, they're like, better not to even think about it at all.
Like, we don't want to know why you're drifting through town.
Yeah.
They're like, we just want to take your money and not talk to you at all.
Yeah, your card goes through, cool.
In terms of the filming locations, the house itself is actually a convent building, which I thought was interesting. And then the pool house is like just a pool house, like an old pool house in Vancouver. In terms of pop culture, I know you have a number of exciting things to talk about here with your expertise.
I do, because obviously Dean, in the beginning, he makes a reference himself to Scooby-Doo.
Yes. Yes, which I think this is the first time. Listeners, correct us if correct me if I'm wrong, if you're listening to this and you know of an earlier Scooby-Doo reference, but I think this might be the first time that we get a Scooby-Doo reference, which is fun.
I mean, I think that is fun, and I think it's interesting that he's referencing specifically Daphne. Though this is most likely not on purpose. Just that Daphne, especially as of, I don't know, probably the past 10 to 20 years, has been a pretty well-known queer figure.
Dean's gaydar picking up on things, I guess.
Yeah. That or being way off the mark.
Oh, and honestly, with Dean, either is entirely possible.
Yep.
Yeah. Because he does go, Fred and Daphne, like he's identifying. It's also interesting, he's identifying both of them. Like those are the two that he's like, those are the two that matter with Scooby-Doo when it comes to Dean. And I'm like, okay. When we think of later references to Scooby-Doo, fun to think about.
And I think that the most prominent reference that's happening in this episode, mainly because I think it's hard to avoid when you have horror in a hotel, is The Shining.
Yeah. You
get a pretty decent idea that they're at least going to hint on it a little. And then there's the scene at the bar where the butler is serving Dean a drink, and it's like frame for frame.
Yeah, they're slamming you in the head with it. Like they're like, you had better notice this is what we're referencing.
Yeah, especially in the beginning, because I think that it's leaning on us understanding this reference a little bit, because we see in the beginning two little girls, they're dressed the same, they look pretty similar. We're supposed to assume these are creepy twins. And they let us hold on to that assumption up until we have the moment with the reveal that Maggie is not real, or that she's not really there anyways.
Yeah, that she's what the mom thinks is an imaginary friend.
Yeah, which I think is a pretty fun turn. I don't know if I'm going to say they did it. I'll give them the credit. They did it intentionally.
Yeah. I also appreciated, in terms of just the mom's characterization, I appreciated that, like, obviously later on in the episode, she kind of goes like, oh, I'm tired of this, like this imaginary friend thing. But at the beginning, she actually is very sympathetic towards it. Like she's very, it's just very child development appropriate. Like where she's like, you have an imaginary friend. Okay, so you're saying, can I ask Matt? You're gonna like play into that. You're going to like acknowledge that that's a significant relationship for your child, even if it's imaginary, and you're going to like you're not going to every time she mentions it be like, oh, she's not real. You're not going to like keep jabbing at that. You're going to just like let her have this thing. And she's an only child. They're in this house pretty alone. I liked that the mom is, for the bulk of, until things kind of get more dicey, the mom like is supportive of this imagination that her daughter has.
Which I think, because the other aspect of the Shining reference there is Stephen King usually, in especially in The Shining and other similar works of his, writes about the breakdown of the family unit. Because of course there's like the aspects of the descent into madness and whatnot, but that's really what it is at its core, is the breakdown of the family unit. And I think that's where this differs from that, almost purposefully, because obviously you've got the subtext happening between, or not the subtext, but the subplot happening between Sam and Dean, where they're having to reevaluate what their family unit is. Mm-hmm. They've just lost their father. There's this thing hanging over their heads about how Dean is maybe going to have to kill Sam. And in contrast, we have the mom's relationship with her daughter, who she seems to fully support, and and she also takes care of her mother, even if she leaves her in a creepy attic. But I think that's more for the drama of it.
I'm assuming her mother doesn't stay in the creepy attic at all times.
Yeah, and there's when she finds Sam and Dean up in the attic with the mom, she doesn't like kick them out like, you can't see this or something. It's like, you're scaring her. I care about her, and this is weird. You need to leave.
She's not like dehumanized.
Yeah. But those are the main pop culture ones that I noticed there. That scene at the bar, that was that was a lot.
It's pretty funny when you like recognize it and go, oh, okay, I see what we're doing here.
Well, because especially like what's happening in that scene in The Shining is the butler, or the spirit of the house, which in this episode the butler is operating more as like the heart of the house, in the sense of, he's lived there his whole life, he cares about what happens here. And has the background knowledge. In The Shining, the spirit of the hotel is trying to convince him to give up, trying to convince him that he knows best, and that his family is not where his loyalties lie, is not where he should be putting his faith or putting his attention. And versus the conversation that happens in Supernatural, where the butler is showing him the different the way that the people who own the house have grown up there, and who matters and why it matters. And it's less, it's kind of the exact opposite. It's not showing him why and how he should disconnect, and it's instead showing him why and how he should connect.
Yeah, that's some really good pop culture stuff. So lastly today, we have our gaydar section. So sexuality and gender connections in this episode. There's big one. If there are others, we will also talk about them. But there's one big glaring thing here. So this is the third episode in which the brothers are mistaken for a gay couple. We are about 30 episodes into this show. This is the third time this has happened. The other two are season 1, episode 8, Bugs, and season 1, episode 18, Something Wicked. So that's our context. What is interesting about that is in this particular episode is not the fact that it's happening in general, because the fact that it happens in general is just is a writing choice that is strange at best and like homophobic at worst. It's unnecessary. It's not even. It's just.
It's odd. It's a choice.
It's a choice, and not like always a super necessary or realistic one.
I think that every time that something like that happens in one of these early episodes, I always have to like pause and remember, like try and place myself back when this episode came out and think of the kinds of jokes that people were saying at the time and sort of compare and contrast that. And while I don't think that this is outside the realm of jokes that were being made, the haha, you guys look gay, isn't that so funny? It's odd that they keep doing it.
Yeah, well, we're like a season and a half in. The fact that it's happened 3 times is like, they're like, this joke, they're like, we think this joke is so funny that we're going to keep making it. So the advantage to us in the specific viewing that we're taking of it and the way that we're looking at it is the reaction to this. Because when it first happens, Dean goes, "What do you mean that we look the type?" And then I don't remember what I don't think the person,
she doesn't
really have an answer. She just kind of like, they kind of just move on. And so the scene ends. We go to another scene, and then Dean brings it up again. It's like, what? It's like, why do people keep assuming this?
The Jackting choices in this episode. I've seen like people be like, analyze this scene, like he's trying to figure out, like he's trying to keep it a secret. Like he's like, they saw something in me, and it's like the internalized homophobia. And I don't understand how you can read it any other way.
he reacts to, well, especially when you compare the fact that this is the third time, and pretty much every time, this is also the thing, is you compare Sam's reaction, you compare Jared's acting choices and Jensen's acting choices, and you go, okay, so one of you plays this, and one of these characters reacts, kind of laughs it off, moves on, doesn't even think about it. One of them doesn't seem bothered by it. And I think like the real like simple reading of that is just like, oh, haha, Sam's not as homophobic as Dean is. But it's way more interesting to look at it through that like queer lens of like, when you're a deeply closeted person who's grown up in an environment that's super macho masculine in an era where homosexuality was often the butt of the joke, if you are wrestling with that on any level, it feels necessary to have a big reaction, to deny vehemently, to be like, well, if I'm loud and brash about the fact that like this isn't true of me, it has the dual thing of like doesn't actually accomplish what you think it accomplishes and makes you seem like you're hiding something, like you're trying really hard to repress something.
Well, and especially like him bringing it up a second time is him asking Sam, who knows him better than anyone.
Yes.
To deny it.
Yeah, he's asking for external validation. He's going like, okay, like people keep saying this, but what do you think, Sam?
Yeah, and then Sam doesn't deny it. He's like, well, you do act kind of butch, so.
Sam's like, no.
Oh, the look on his face.
It's so good. It's so good because Dean is clearly like hoping that Sam will be able to sort of clear it for him and kind of be like, oh, those people are dumb. Like, obviously you're not gay. Instead, Sam is like, well, have you considered this kind of thing? Let me just like dig it. And then that just like, then Dean has to then Dean gets really flustered and just wants to drop it because I think he maybe realizes that he's going to start digging himself a hole that he can't get out of if he keeps bearing down on this issue. Like, why is it such a big deal to you? It seems like this in the early seasons that are really interesting in terms of like Dean's progression when it comes to sexuality, because in the early seasons, anytime we get anything that could be like kind of read queer, a lot of times it is in this like really homophobic sort of context, as opposed to later on where his reactions are going to get a lot more muted when things get referenced, when people make jokes about him or him and Cass. He's just sort of gonna like roll his eyes and move on. Like he's not going to do the same kind of vehement denial that he's doing at this point, which as we get further away from John, as we get further away from 2005, as they meet other queer people, and it gets more normalized for him.
And I think that like if you want to make the least amount of assumptions possible, you can just say that Dean felt some kind of way about somebody thinking that he was gay, and he did not feel the same kind of way that Sam did.
Yeah.
And that feels significant.
As we add more information to that, as we go along, we get closer to being able to be a little more definitive about what kind of significance that carries. Even at this point, we can go, that's something we're going to bookmark for coming back to. So it is now time for us to pick a theme song for this week based on our discussion and what it's kind of evoked in us. Go ahead.
So I first, just by what the theme was, my first thought was to pick Peace by Taylor Swift, because I'm a big Swiftie, but the song really doesn't apply here, I don't think. So I had to think more than that. And then I came to the next, I think, perhaps most obvious solution, which was Hotel California, which, not just because it's a song about a hotel, but because the song itself is about never quite getting peace. I mean, the song itself, it reminds me of insomnia, of never quite feeling settled in your skin and never quite reaching an end point. Like you can check out, but you can never leave. Like it's gonna linger with you.
The song that I chose for this episode is called Echoes. It's by Radical Face, and it's there's a few lyrics particularly in it, and I'm just gonna read a couple of them. Like an echo sounding from my sins, come on, let me in. I remember the cast on your arm from when we were convinced. This song, I'm just reminded of the way that particularly the way that Sam is sort of feeling in this episode. episode, whereas there's this like desperation and there's this, he's taking all of this angst and fear and he's trying to figure out how to he's both internalizing it in terms of the way he thinks about himself, but he's also externalizing it in the way that he's trying to solution with Dean for what happens in the worst case scenario. And this song kind of just like had some of those emotional beats to it. So that's our little episode mixtape for today. Not happy songs today. Finally today, we have our fan fiction recommendation of the week. Originally, this section was going to try and be, you know, fan fiction that like connected in some way to the episode or to the theme. And then I realized that mostly I read, spoiler alert, SDL fics. And it became really difficult to find fanfics that were connected. I spent like an hour one day trying to find any fanfic about Ash and then gave up because I was like, there's nothing good on the internet. I was very sad about it. So this has just become more of a general recommendation section for things that we're enjoying. As always, with this section, read the tags. You're responsible for what you read.
So I recommend this mainly because of the gothic vibes of this episode.
Nice.
Though, as you said, heed the warnings. I think it's probably a little weird.
We love weird. We love weird.
Good. So it's called Angel in the Marble. It is a Destiel fic. I don't really read any of the others. The author, it's spelled Zuzeca. It is more canon compliant than you would think.
Okay. I really enjoy fics that are super like very canon compliant in a lot of ways and then have some divergence that is what gives them that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So the fic I'm going to recommend is actually one I haven't finished yet, so bearing that in mind, but I'm really enjoying it so far. It's just kind of fun. It's called Watching You, Watching Me, Watching You. It's by Tripped and Fell into Purgatory, and it's a sort of a fluffy film. It's basically the idea of like inter-universe Netflix and going off of the whole Supernatural is a book series. What if it was also a TV show within their universe and that's the premise. And I'm not going to say much more because I haven't finished it myself, and so I don't know all the twists, and also just I mostly got into it because of the premise and it was recommended to me. It is unfinished as far as I know, just based on looking at the AO3 information. However, I don't know if that's the case and where the author is in terms of it. It was updated earlier this year, about a number of months ago. So, but it's pretty funny. So that brings us to the end of our show. You can subscribe to Driver Picks the Podcast wherever you get your shows, and please come talk to us on social media or send in a question or a comment for a future episode. We'd love to include it. There is a link in the show notes where you can find us. And thank you, Jessy, so much for being here today. This was so much fun.
Thank you for having me.
Can you once again tell listeners where they can find you on the internet? And I will also put that in the show notes.
You can find me on TikTok at .tired.gay. The dots are periods. I don't know how to say it cohesively, but yeah, and that's on TikTok.
Wonderful. Thank you to all of our listeners for coming along for the ride, and we wish you a peaceful road until we meet again. Next week, we will be discussing Season 2, Episode 12, Night Shifter, through the theme of technology. A note to our listeners. This episode was recorded prior to our Season 3 name change, where we went from Driver Picks the Podcast to Saving People, Queering Things. For all of our new social media platforms, visit queeringthingspodcast.com.